Beloved, Psalm 112 opens before us like a quiet sunrise after a long night. It speaks not in haste, but with assurance, reminding us that provision is not born from anxiety, but from reverence. Blessed is the one who fears the Lord, who delights greatly in his commandments. This fear is not terror, it is trust. It is the settled posture of a soul that leans fully upon God and refuses to bow to the spirit of lack. Lack speaks loudly in this world. It whispers that there is not enough time, not enough strength, not enough provision for tomorrow. Yet the psalm answers with holy certainty, wealth and riches are in his house, and his righteousness endures forever. This is not merely about material abundance, but about sufficiency rooted in God's faithfulness. When the heart is aligned with him, scarcity loses its authority. Fear no longer governs decisions, and generosity flows without striving. The righteous are described as steady, unshaken by evil reports. They do not live at the mercy of circumstances, for their confidence rests in the Lord. Even in darkness, light rises for them. This light is the assurance that God sees, God provides, and God sustains. Provision is activated not by grasping, but by trusting, not by hoarding, but by walking uprightly before him. So today, as we receive the words of Psalm 112, we renounce the spirit of lack that has tried to settle over our minds and homes. We choose reverence over fear, obedience over worry, faith over uncertainty, and in this holy alignment, provision flows quietly, steadily, and surely, because the Lord himself is our source, now and always. Reverence for God is the quiet beginning of all true provision, and Psalm 112 places this truth gently yet firmly before the soul. It does not rush to promise abundance before it establishes alignment. It begins with the inner posture of a person who fears the Lord, not with trembling dread, but with a deep, settled awe that recognizes God as the source of all life, sustenance, and meaning. This reverence reshapes the way a person sees lack. Lack is no longer a defining reality, but a passing shadow that cannot overrule the faithfulness of God. When the heart is anchored in holy reverence, scarcity loses its power to intimidate, and fear is stripped of its authority. The spirit of lack thrives where reverence has been replaced by anxiety. It feeds on the constant calculation of what is missing, what might fail, and what tomorrow may demand. But reverence redirects the gaze upward. It teaches the soul to look first to God rather than to circumstances. Psalm 112 declares, "Blessed the one who fears the Lord, because such a person lives from a different center. Their peace does not rise and fall with supply, and their confidence does not depend on visible resources." Reverence establishes order within the heart, and where divine order exists, lack cannot rule. This fear of the Lord is inseparable from delight in his ways. It is not forced obedience, but willing surrender. The heart that delights in God's commandments is not burdened by them, because it trusts the wisdom behind them. Such a heart understands that God does not lead his people into loss, but into life. Even when obedience seems costly, reverence believes that God's ways are never empty. This belief quietly dismantles the lie of lack, which claims that obedience leads to deprivation and faith leads to disappointment. Psalm 112 corrects this lie by showing that righteousness itself carries provision within it. The righteous person described in the psalm is not portrayed as restless or grasping. There is no frantic pursuit, no anxious striving. Instead, there is stability. Wealth and riches are said to dwell in their house, but the greater emphasis is on righteousness that endures. This endurance is crucial, for lack often appears not in moments, but across time. It wears down the soul through prolonged waiting and repeated uncertainty. Reverence gives the heart patience to endure without losing trust. It teaches the soul that provision is not always immediate. but it is always faithful. To fear the Lord is to acknowledge that He governs what is seen and unseen. It is to accept that supply is not limited to what the eyes can measure. This awareness liberates the heart from panic when visible resources diminish. The reverent soul understands that God's storehouses are not confined to earthly systems. When lack threatens, reverence whispers truth. God is not finished, God is not surprised, and God is not absent. This quiet confidence is itself a form of provision because it preserves peace when fear would otherwise consume the mind. Psalm 112 also reveals that reverence shapes character and character shapes experience. The one who fears the Lord is gracious, compassionate, and righteous. These qualities are not accidental. They are fruits of a heart free from the tyranny of lack. A fearful heart hoards, but a reverent heart gives. A fearful heart closes in, but a reverent heart opens outward. Generosity becomes possible because the soul trusts that God is sufficient. This generosity further breaks the power of lack, for it declares through action that God's supply is greater than human need. Lack often manifests first as fear of loss. Reverence heals this fear by anchoring identity in God rather than possessions. When a person knows they belong to God, they no longer measure their worth by what they have or lack. This freedom weakens the grip of scarcity on the soul. The psalm describes a person whose heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. Firmness of heart is a direct result of reverence. A firm heart is not easily shaken by news, rumors, or sudden changes. It remains steady because it is rooted in God's character, not in external stability. The breaking of lack begins internally, long before it is visible externally. Reverence renews the inner life, teaching the soul to rest. This rest is not passivity but confidence. It allows a person to work, plan, and labor without being enslaved by outcomes. Such freedom is rare in a world driven by scarcity thinking. Psalm 112 offers an alternative vision, a life where provision flows naturally from alignment with God rather than from constant struggle. Even in darkness, the psalm says, light rises for the upright. Darkness represents moments when lack appears most convincing, when prayers seem unanswered and resources feel thin. Reverence does not deny the darkness, but it refuses to interpret darkness as abandonment. The reverent heart believes that light is not absent, only rising. This belief sustains hope and keeps the soul from despair. Hope itself becomes nourishment, strengthening the heart to continue trusting. The fear of the Lord also guards the mind against comparison, which is one of lack's most destructive tools. Comparison convinces the soul that others have more, are more blessed, or are more favored. Reverence silences this noise by fixing the gaze on God alone. When God becomes the reference point, comparison loses relevance. The heart becomes content, not because it has everything, but because it trusts the one who provides all things. Psalm 112 portrays a life that is secure, not because it is untouched by trouble, but because it is rightly ordered. Reverence orders priorities, desires, and expectations. It teaches the soul to seek God first, trusting that provision follows alignment. This order brings peace even before abundance arrives. In this way, reverence itself is already a form of provision, supplying stability, clarity, and assurance. The spirit of lack cannot coexist with true reverence because lack depends on the illusion that God is insufficient. Reverence exposes this illusion by affirming God's sovereignty and goodness. It declares, often silently but powerfully, that God knows what is needed before it is asked. This trust does not make the soul careless. It makes it wise. It replaces impulsive decisions with prayerful discernment and fear-driven actions with faithful obedience. Over time, reverence cultivates a legacy. Psalm 112 speaks of descendants being mighty in the land. This is not merely a promise of material inheritance, but of spiritual stability passed from one generation to another. When children witness a life governed by reverence rather than fear, they inherit confidence rather than anxiety. In this way, lack is broken not only for one life but for many. Reverence also transforms the way trials are interpreted. Instead of seeing difficulty as evidence of lack, the reverent heart sees it as a season of refinement. This perspective preserves faith and prevents bitterness. It allows the soul to remain open and trusting even when provision seems delayed. Delay no longer feels like denial because reverence trusts God's timing as much as his supply. The righteous person described in Psalm 112 is remembered as one who is not afraid of bad news. This freedom from fear is not ignorance but trust. It is the fruit of long-formed reverence that has learned again and again that God is faithful. Each remembered deliverance strengthens the soul against future fear. Over time, lack loses credibility because experience has proven God's sufficiency. Reverence teaches the soul to live from gratitude rather than complaint. Gratitude acknowledges what God has already provided, while complaint magnifies what seems absent. Psalm 112 leans toward gratitude by highlighting the blessings of righteousness. This gratitude multiplies peace and deepens trust. It shifts the heart from survival to stewardship, from worry to worship. Ultimately, reverence for God is not a technique to gain provision, but a relationship that restores order. Provision flows naturally where order is restored. The psalm does not invite striving for blessing, but abiding in reverence. In that abiding, fear dissolves, lack loses its voice, and the soul learns to rest in the steady faithfulness of God, confident that he who gives life also sustains it fully and faithfully. Trust in the Lord is not a momentary feeling, but a sustained posture of the heart, and Psalm 112 presents this trust as the quiet engine that activates steady and enduring provision. Unlike the restless confidence that depends on visible outcomes, this trust is anchored in the unchanging nature of God. It is learned over time, formed through obedience, prayer, and remembrance of God's faithfulness. When the soul truly trusts the Lord, provision no longer feels uncertain or fragile because its source is understood to be eternal rather than temporary. The psalm describes a person whose heart is firm, trusting in the Lord, and this firmness is not stubbornness but stability. A firm heart does not panic when resources fluctuate, nor does it collapse under pressure. It stands because it rests upon God's character rather than human systems. Trust reshapes the inner life, teaching the soul to wait without anxiety and to act without fear. This inner steadiness is itself a form of provision, sustaining the spirit long before material needs are met. Provision that flows from trust is steady because it is not driven by urgency. Urgency often produces rash decisions, compromises, and fear-based actions that ultimately deepen lack. Trust slows the soul down. It invites patience and discernment. When a person trusts the Lord, they no longer feel compelled to secure their future at the cost of their integrity. Psalm 112 quietly affirms that righteousness and provision walk together, and that what God supplies will never require the abandonment of faith. The psalm speaks of one who is not afraid of bad news, a phrase that carries profound weight. Bad news is inevitable in a broken world, yet fear is not. Trust creates a space between information and reaction. The trusting heart receives news without allowing it to redefine reality. It understands that circumstances are not sovereign, God is, This understanding protects the mind from spiraling into despair and keeps hope alive even when external evidence seems thin. Trust also transforms the way the future is perceived. Rather than seeing tomorrow as a threat, the trusting soul sees it as held by God. This vision removes the pressure to control outcomes. Control is often mistaken for wisdom, but it is usually a symptom of fear. Trust releases the illusion of control and replaces it with confidence in God's care. In this release, the heart finds peace, and peace becomes fertile ground for provision to grow. Psalm 112 reveals that trust produces generosity, not hesitation. The one who trusts the Lord is described as lending freely and conducting affairs with justice. This generosity does not arise from excess alone, but from confidence. Trust assures the heart that giving will not result in loss. It breaks the cycle of hoarding that scarcity creates. As generosity flows, provision is activated not only materially, but relationally and spiritually, enriching the entire life. Enduring provision is closely tied to consistency of trust. Many trust God in moments of blessing, but struggle to do so in seasons of uncertainty. The psalm presents trust as a constant orientation rather than a seasonal response. This constancy allows provision to endure because it is not dependent on emotional highs or favorable conditions. Trust becomes the rhythm of life, guiding decisions, shaping responses, and sustaining hope. The trusting heart also learns to interpret delay differently. Delay is no longer seen as absence, but as preparation. Trust believes that God's timing is purposeful, even when it is painful. This belief preserves the soul from bitterness and resentment. It keeps faith alive during waiting, which is often the most challenging aspect of provision. Waiting tests trust, but it also deepens it, producing a faith that can endure long after immediate needs are met. Psalm 112 emphasizes that the righteous will be remembered and honored. This remembrance is not rooted in wealth alone, but in faithfulness. Trust leaves a legacy. It teaches others, often silently, that God can be relied upon. Children, communities, and generations are shaped by witnessing a life that trusts God through uncertainty. In this way, provision extends beyond the individual and becomes communal, strengthening many through the example of one. Trust also guards the heart against fear-driven narratives. Fear exaggerates threats and minimizes God's power. Trust reverses this pattern. It magnifies God's faithfulness and places challenges in proper perspective. This shift of focus is crucial, for what the heart magnifies shapes its experience. When God is magnified, provision becomes believable even before it is visible. The psalm speaks of the wicked gnashing their teeth and fading away, while the desire of the righteous endures. This contrast highlights the difference between striving and trusting. Striving exhausts the soul and produces temporary results. Trust sustains the soul and produces lasting fruit. The provision that comes from trust is not easily stolen or destroyed because it is rooted in God's promises rather than human effort alone. Trust also brings clarity in decision-making. When fear governs choices, confusion multiplies. Trust simplifies life by aligning decisions with faith. This alignment prevents many forms of loss that arise from fear-based compromise. In this sense, trust protects provision as much as it activates it. It keeps what God gives from being wasted, misused, or lost through impatience. The steady provision described in Psalm 112 is inseparable from peace. Peace is not the absence of need, but the presence of trust. This peace guards the heart and mind, preserving strength for the journey. A peaceful soul is better able to recognize and receive provision when it arrives. Anxiety often blinds the heart to what God is already doing. Trust opens the eyes and sharpens spiritual perception. Trust also restores dignity to the human experience. Lack often humiliates, convincing the soul that it is forgotten or unworthy. Trust counters this lie by affirming identity as one cared for by God. This dignity empowers the heart to stand upright even in times of need. It prevents desperation from shaping behavior and preserves integrity under pressure. Over time, trust becomes testimony. Each season of provision, whether large or small, reinforces confidence in God's faithfulness. These memories form a reservoir of hope that can be drawn upon in trials. Psalm 112 reflects this cumulative faith, where trust is not naive but informed by experience. It is the trust of a heart that has seen God act and therefore refuses to surrender to fear. The enduring nature of provision is tied to the enduring nature of trust. Temporary trust produces temporary peace, but sustained trust produces lasting stability. This stability does not mean life is without challenge, but that challenges no longer define the soul. Trust anchors identity, preserves hope, and invites God's faithful provision to flow steadily through every season. In trusting the Lord, the soul finds freedom from constant calculation and worry. Life becomes less about survival and more about stewardship. Provision is received with gratitude and shared with wisdom. This freedom reflects the heart of Psalm 112, where trust in the Lord creates a life marked not by lack, but by quiet abundance, enduring peace, and unwavering confidence in God's faithful care.